I didn't like
So,
it.
what I wanted to present today was not so much my brilliance and expertise on differential case management, because you all are probably the experts on that, because you live that stuff. You live case management day to day. What my perspective is on this presentation is just to make sure you all are aware of the tools that eCourt provides you in your day-to-day case management activities, or if your court is about to embark on a delay reduction program or implement a differential case management program, plan I should say, then what can eCourt do for you? That's really where I'm coming from. I don't know case management as well as you do, but I do know eCourt, and so that's what I wanted to talk about with this presentation. So having said that, I can say, well, what the heck is differential case management? Basically, every court that has implemented some form of differential case management has kind of done their own thing. Each court determines what their differential case management plan is going to entail. And it basically is something that each court develops, and it meets local needs. Different judicial communities are different, legal communities are different. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Also, of course, in 50 states, there's 50 different sets of civil procedures. So there's not a one-size-fits-all. But from the research that I've done, it seems that there are some commonalities between the different jurisdictions that have gotten heavily into differential case management, and those are things like judicial officers, judges, administrative law judges, whatever you want to, whatever it is in your world, are assigned for all proceedings either at case filing immediately or at least after all parties have appeared. So it's an individual calendar versus the old-fashioned master calendar approach. Also, there's some effort to categorize and understand, at least, or assign cases to a different track very early in the process. In some cases, as I said, at case filing. In others, after the initial status or case management conference is held, which, by the way, that initial appearance is scheduled right up front at case initiation. So I guess in the traditional approach, and I was with, for those of you who don't know me, I've been with Sustain now for 12 years. I'm an implementation manager now. I've implemented eCourt as well as Sustain Justice Edition in a number of different court jurisdictions up and down California, as well as for eCourt out of state. Before that, I was with LA Superior Court, and one of the things that I did for them was rolling out our old Sustain DOS product to several of the branch locations that didn't have anything. This is back in the early 90s to mid-90s. So, I forgot where I was going with that.
It's because with all of that years of experience, you have a total understanding of DCM and what you're presenting in the
No.
today.
You know, there was a point there for you to that, and someday it'll come back to me.
Master calendar versus
Master calendar, thank you, Greg, yes. When I was with LA Superior Court, this is back in the late 80s, early 90s, they were still doing a lot of case assignments as master calendar. And that has proven to be, in the experience of courts that have embarked on trial delay reduction or differential case management, has shown that individual calendar assignments work much better than a master calendar approach for reducing delay. So that's where I was coming from. So there aren't very many places that still do a master calendar assignment. And that is that cases are assigned to some judge, either the presiding judge or some court commissioner, who basically acts as a traffic cop. That person decides, okay, you're ready for trial, you go down the hall. You're ready for trial, you go upstairs and to the left. Just basically a traffic cop. And so when they are ready for trial, that trial judge's first introduction to that case, is that day. Well, big surprise, since that judge doesn't know anything about that case, It's just a less efficient way of proceeding versus individual calendar where a judicial officer or administrative law judge is assigned right up front and knows the parties, knows the issues, and experience has shown that settlements can happen more readily and sooner in the process than would otherwise be the case. So individual calendar is a very common feature of DCM. Also, I mentioned some kind of categorization. Now that can be based on the issues involved. It could be based on a case versus with just two parties opposed to one another. Might be at one track. One with 10 parties would be a whole different level of complexity. Also, if there's a pro per or pro se, depending on what part of the country you come from, litigant, that tends to slow things down. So that could cause a case to be assigned to a different track. And the tracks really are a collection of deadlines and degrees of management by the court. So very commonly there might be three. There might be an expedited track, a standard track, and a complex track. And an expedited track is one where the case is not particularly complex. There aren't a large number of parties. There's probably not likely to be a great deal of discovery that's necessary. So that one, a fairly straightforward case, perhaps a tort case, a slip and fall, a motor vehicle case, might be one that could be assigned to the expedited track, versus a contract litigation or product liability that involved large numbers of parties, might be one that might be designated a complex case. So a complex case is going to require longer discovery. We'll probably have many more pretrial motions, so that's all going to take longer. And then in the middle you have the standard track, which is like your default assumption. Money? That would have, I guess, an average number of discovery items, pretrial motions, things like that. So again, these tracks that are talked about in DCM are essentially collections of, for those of you who already know a little bit about eCourt, what we might call time standards, deadlines, and degrees of judicial intervention necessary. Within each track, the court actively manages case deadlines, sets and schedules future appointment appearances early. So that's where the idea of not just case management, but differential case management. In other words, not all the bottom line is not all cases are created equal. Some are going to move through the system more quickly than others, and the idea behind DCM is that the court takes that into account and designs activities for processing different cases at different rates of speed. So with that as prologue, how can eCourt support a differential case management plan? One way is through, we talked about, that assigning a judicial officer at the very beginning or soon thereafter would be an important feature. Well, of course, eCourt, you all know about workflow. Among the many things that workflow can do would be to assign a judge, perhaps as early as the filing of the case, to be the judge presiding for all proceedings on a given case. So that can be as basic or as complicated as you want it to be. So the screenshot that you've got here is, you can see the condition over here. This one is about as basic as it gets. If it's a civil or a protective order case, execute a business rule that says assign a judge. Now, this could be expanded upon to incorporate things such as, well, what track was assigned? If the track was assigned at case filing. Now, notice that the trigger on this workflow is case insert. That means immediately upon filing of a case, if it's civil or protective order, a judge will be assigned. So virtually nothing will be known about the case, at least by the staff who entered it into the system, other than that it was civil or protective order. So that's why I said this is a pretty simple and basic one. If the track has already been assigned, then you could have 3 separate workflows for 3 separate tracks with judicial resources assigned to each track. So perhaps more senior administrative law judges or judges who have more experience in handling, for instance, product liability cases might be in a separate workflow with a separate group of participants, only the more senior judges. And those folks would have their own workflow, and the text up here talks about the percentage assignment method. So if it's a manual queue, as this would end up being, then potentially percentages for each judge in that pool of judges could be worked out so that if there are 3 judges in your complex civil case work, then each one could get 33%, and that the system would always check when a new case is filed, checks that percentage. It weights their current caseload to see, okay, Judge Bill seems to have fewer cases than Judge Fred or Judge Sam, so it will automatically assign it to Judge Bill. That's how percentage works. This one here that's on the screen is actually not utilizing that. That's actually a custom business rule that just does it purely at random. So it calls some random function. This is in a test configuration, by the way. This isn't anybody's. But it just generates a random number and uses that to calculate who would be the next judge assigned.
Is there a way for it to look at what the judges are assigned, and okay, he's assigned a case this week, and he's got 2 cases on this week, but next week he has 5 cases, and this one's going to be a 14-day case, so we'll take that into account?
I would probably do something like that using the percentage assignment method, and then separate them, as I was saying earlier, in terms of levels of complexity. So that somebody who has a large number of complex cases, you're right, probably shouldn't get the next 5 simple ones. So by breaking them out into separate tracks, even in terms of judicial assignment, I think is how I would address that. So one way, as I was saying, of assigning a case to a track is the person who's entering the case. This is a snippet of a case initiation form. So the person who's creating the case could make that determination. And presumably it would be somebody who would know what they're doing. You wouldn't have the clerk that was just hired 2 weeks ago doing it. So if you've got a civil clerk who is very knowledgeable about civil procedure in your jurisdiction, then that might be one option for you, is to just assign it based on that person's assessment of its level of complexity, based on whatever criteria makes sense in your jurisdiction. So here's an example of one where we utilize the special status, the case special status entity of eCourt to capture the track assignment. If you didn't want to have a clerk being the one to make that decision, but rather wanted to have a judge or law clerk or something like that be the one, then there's other ways of assigning a case to a track. For example, we talked about sort of what we were talking about earlier just a moment ago, Greg. Workflow could make that determination based on combinations of the criteria that we've already talked about. So for instance, if a case is a motor vehicle case versus a product liability case, that could be codified into a business rule. If the case contains no pro per or pro se litigants, then that could be part of the business rule. If the case had more than 2 parties and 2 attorneys, that could be part of the business rule. So just as I said, depending on what makes sense in your jurisdiction, if it's something that could be stated and programmed as a business rule, then a rule could be the one to make that, with the logic provided by your judicial staff or legal staff. Another possibility is, as I said earlier, very often a first appearance is scheduled immediately at case filing. In other words, a piece of paper is handed to or an email is returned, if it's electronically filed, to the petitioner or plaintiff, so that they know immediately you've got an appearance on such and such a date. And that is a case management conference or a status conference or whatever you all call it. At the conclusion of that conference, the judicial officer could make the determination there. He or she now has met with the attorneys and the parties, knows has an idea of what the case is about, and at that point might be in the best position of making that determination. So one possibility is that decision is held off until after the first appearance. And at that first appearance, the judge or a clerk would enter an event result into the system, and that event result would contain the case assignment. That could either be, and that could involve a business rule and workflow, which is looking for that as a triggering event. Oh, okay. Case management was heard and assignment to expedited track was made. Boom, there's a workflow looking for that very code. And when it finds it, it will make the special status assignment of expedited track. So then that track assignment could trigger a series of time standards, such as whatever it might be. Discovery cutoff will be an N number of days. Pretrial motions must be completed by such and such a day, and your next appearance will be scheduled within X number of days. So I mentioned case special statuses. I've always found that to be, even going back to our DOS days, I've always found case special status to be a very useful entity because of the fact that it's so versatile. So I was talking about utilizing case special status to track the track that it's on, track the track. One thing I like about it is it's got a start date as well as an end date, so that if at some point the case track assignment changes, then you can maintain that history. Initially, it was thought that this would be a standard case track, but during the discovery process, it was realized that this should be a complex or it should be an expedited. So we end that tier status and we start a new one and we maintain the history. And of course, the other nice thing about it is your headers can be configured to show the track. This particular configuration does not do that for the tier status, but it does do it for this status here, to show that, hey, this is something that is important to that jurisdiction. So that's one other thing that, and of course, as you know, anything that's in the header up here, and of course this is just a fraction of the header, but if you see it in the header here, you'll see it no matter which of these folder views you're on. So if you're in the documents folder view, you'll still see, in this case it's a person special status, it could be the track assignment. And that I think is useful from a DCM perspective, because if the judge has this case up on his or her screen because they're in a status conference right now, it's helpful to have that picture right between the eyes. Okay, this is a complex, or this is an expedited. The other neat thing about special statuses is they can be configured to toll time on case aging. Now, let's unpack that. One other thing that eCourt does is it automatically calculates age of a case dynamically. Now, for those of you who were Justice Edition clients, you say, well, big deal. Justice Edition's been doing that for 20 years, and that's absolutely correct. eCourt does it as well. So you see up here in the corner that we're displaying dynamically the age. And it says it's 17 days old. Okay, well, that's interesting. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So I said special statuses can also be used to toll time, or in other words, cause the dynamic case aging that I just talked about to stop. So let's look at this. This case was filed in April of 2010. It's open. There's no disposition on this case, and yet the system thinks it's only 17 days old. Well, what's up with that? What's up with that is, in this configuration, a bench warrant was issued in May of 2010, and lo and behold, That's 1,599 days ago. So from a DCM perspective, the court lost control of this case when the guy skipped. So a bench warrant has been issued for his arrest. There's nothing that the court can do to dispose of this case until the guy is picked up. So rather than let this case sit in the court's inventory, messing up their stats, which that's legitimate. It's not the court's fault that this guy skipped. So rather than letting this case just sit out there at 1,618 days old and have people go, why can't you dispose of this case? Well, we don't have the guy. It's a criminal case and he fled the jurisdiction. So legitimately, there's nothing the court can do. So special statuses can be configured to toll time. So we're tracking here how long ago that bench warrant was issued. Someday we'll pick him up, and at that point we will resume on day 18. We won't add that 1,600 days back to the case age because that was legit. The court never did have control over the case at that point. So that's useful for management reporting of the effectiveness of your DCM program, because that's an important part. If your court were to embark on a heavy-duty thing like setting up a differential case management plan in your jurisdiction, you're going to want to know how successful it is. Is it worth the effort? And the fact that we can toll time on case aging helps to prove the effectiveness of the effort. The other thing the other interesting thing that, in this case, person special status, not case special status. So there's actually two. In this configuration here, you notice we saw something called active duty military. In this configuration, it doesn't say case special status, it's just called alerts. It's a little bit more user-friendly. But this is actually a person special status. So this is showing us that one party on this case is active duty military, and so there's not much the court can do to move this case along because perhaps the person is deployed overseas. So this is just a flag, in this case, at the person level to indicate that there's not much we can do. In addition to things like that, person special status can also flag parties who are VL, in this case stands for vexatious litigants. So that also would impact a court's decision when it comes to a track assignment. If you've got somebody who is a vexatious litigant, then they're probably going to go in the complex track, I would assume. It's not something that's going to be expedited because that's just the nature of the beast. So, and in this configuration, you can see that person special statuses were configured in this way rather than all spelled out, but they are also visible in this case on the Parties tab. So this is the Parties tab rather than Case Assignment. And again, just as with the case special status, the fact that there is a vexatious litigant on the case being displayed on the header tells anybody who looks at this case, oh, okay, that's going to impact how you proceed with this case. So, we talked about track assignments influencing the deadlines and the expectations of a different for the different tracks. All those deadlines and expectations can be codified as time standards, and the thing is, you can have different sets of time standards. You're not required, it's not a one-size-fits-all product, so therefore this is an example of a time standard that is a discovery cutoff for expedited track cases, and you can see here that the start time is when a case special status record is inserted and it's an expedited case track. Oops. So if a special status is inserted and the special status is expedited case track, this time standard will be created on a case. All right? And it will expire 120 days, step forward if not business day. What the heck is that? Well, I'll come back to that. After the trigger time. okay? So that if today a case special status record of expedited was inserted on a case, the expiration of that time standard for discovery cutoff would be 120 days later, all right? Now, let's deal with this step forward is not business day. Typically, 120 days in a court environment meant 120 calendar days, but of course, if that 120th day was not a court business day, then people would have to manually make adjustments. Okay, it's Sunday, so therefore it'll be Monday, right? Now, with eCourt, I know we had to do that kind of thing in Justice Edition. With eCourt, it can make that calculation for you from right here in time standards. So we give you, oops, I thought I had another one right behind that. We give you a bunch of options for configuring the expiration. So we've got regular days, of course, and that you can still use just plain calendar days, and if it doesn't matter that the expiration date is a court holiday, then that's fine. You can still use days. It's also got hours, it's got years, it's got months. I've never used years or months. I think I've seen hours. And then it's got some relatively new time elements, and that is step forward and step back is another. So step forward would be if the 120th day were to fall on, say, Thanksgiving Day, which is a 4-day holiday here in the States, for all of our Canadian friends, then it would step forward 4 additional days so that the time standard would expire on the Monday after the Thanksgiving holiday. Now, if it said step back, it would go in reverse. So that if the holiday, if the 120th day were to fall on the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend, it would step back 4 days so that the expiration would be on that Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So, just as I said in the searching class, there's no one right answer. Even within the same organization, there can be some time standards where the litigant gets the benefit of those extra days. It's not the litigant's fault that the 120th day fell on Thanksgiving. You get 4 extra days. Congratulations. On the other hand, even within the same jurisdiction, there are some instances where the court, unfortunately, has to take it on the chin, and you may get up to 4 fewer days to do whatever this time standard says you're supposed to do. It just depends on, you know, if it's according to statute, well, then you're kind of stuck. So we give you that functionality either way. There's also, I neglected to mention business days, but you have to be careful. Business days means just count business days. So in other words, if I said 120 business days, that means not counting any weekends or holidays, just counting out 120 Monday through Fridays that are not holidays. So that's usually not what courts mean when they say business days, in my experience anyway. So that's where this days, step forward or step back comes in. But business days can be useful for instance, if there's a 24-hour time standard on something, perhaps 24 hours for the scheduling clerk to set a matter for trial, for instance, from the time that it dropped into their workflow, then obviously 1 day isn't going to work. You want to use 1 business day because they're not going to come in on Saturday and Sunday to do it. So if it's a Friday, you want to give until Monday. So business days is also another option.
Keith, can I just ask a clarification? So
Yeah.
from my experience, it's calendar days versus business days. Calendar is straight 120 days, including every single day, weekends, holidays.
Correct.
Business days is your Monday through Friday. Is either option is available?
Yes.
Does it differentiate, again, between calendar days versus business? With the exception of yes or no, include a holiday with consideration for the holiday when your 120th day, if it falls on a holiday or if it falls on a weekend.
So that's what is shown on the screen right now. So days step forward if not business day is calendar days. Okay, so it will count Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays in computing what is 120 days.
Okay.
But when it gets to that 120th
All right.
day, that's when it figures out, okay, this is the business day. Do I step forward or do I step back?
So then, does it also count 120 days, but only count business days,
Yes.
meaning Monday through Friday?
That's
which would be
a different option, which
Okay.
isn't shown on the screen here. But yes, there is a business day selection
Okay.
that you can. That means count out 120 business days. So obviously that would be more than 120 calendar days. That would be later.
Okay,
So you can do both.
okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. All right. So time standards. Like I said, I really like case special status, and you know what? I really like time standards too, because again, they are so flexible. You can, any significant milestone in a case's life cycle can be used to create a time standard. So, for instance, if all parties have answered, that could trigger a time standard of whatever, n number of days until the first appearance, perhaps, or until the assignment of a case track. If a particular document is filed, that can trigger a due date for a response from the opposing party. The conclusion of, as I said on the screen here, the conclusion of a status conference can trigger the creation of a time standard for ADR if they are assigned to ADR. Or for discovery cutoff, or for all pretrial motions to be filed. And again, as you saw in the previous slide, you can have different time standards for your different tracks. So a different time standard can be triggered with a different deadline for an expedited versus a standard versus a complex. Also, it even works in reverse. The setting of a trial date, for instance, can trigger a deadline for exchange of witness lists for some number of days before the trial. So it's not only, notice here we've got a drop down, after. You can actually choose n number of days before the triggering event. So if the triggering event is set a trial date, then 10 days or 30 days before that is when that thing, whatever it might be, is due. Okay. This was that slide that I was thinking of earlier. So these are our choices here as far as what you can choose. You've got regular plain old days. So if day 120 is a Sunday, that's what you're going to get. You got business days. Don't count weekends or holidays. Weeks, months, years, hours, those are less commonly used, but we give them to you anyway. And then here's our days step forward if not business day, and days step back if not business day. Just depends on the situation.
Can we define our own
What's that?
condition? Can we define our own condition?
You can't define a different one of these, but you can define different time frames. Does that make sense? So an answer perhaps could be due in 30 days. A trial date should be scheduled within, I don't know, 270 days. So this is selectable over here, but you must choose from among this list here.
Do you get to define what your business day is?
Yes. Important point, thank you. So elsewhere in eCourt, it keeps track of your court holiday. There's an actual holidays table, as you all probably know. And that days, not business day functionality reads the holiday table. So of course, it's very important, you already know this if you're live, it's very important to always make sure your holiday table is late. You don't want somebody scheduling somebody for an appearance on what turns out to be the Queen's birthday if you're Canadian, or President's Day, or whatever it might be, because nobody went into the system and updated the holiday table for next year. So here we are, it's September, just planting the seed. You might want to make sure that someone has made sure that your holidays for next year are correct. Because as we are in about September, probably people are starting to assign matters for appearances in the new year, So you want to make sure that that is correct. And if you do that, then these time standards will take that into account. And of course, different jurisdictions even within the states. In California, we've got Cesar Chavez's birthday, and DC, they have DC Emancipation Day. So every jurisdiction, we don't all have the same, we have many of the same, but we don't all have the same holidays. And the holiday table gives you the flexibility to define your own holidays for your jurisdiction. One of our, just as an aside, one of our clients, due to budget limitations, they were having furlough days where the offices were closed. I think it was one Friday a month or something of that nature. And we set those up as holidays for that year. They no longer do that, but for all intents and purposes, it was a holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas. We didn't want any matters scheduled for that day, so we just added them to...
Unpaid.
Yeah, unpaid. So we just added them to the holiday table. So the other reason that I really like time standards is they are permanent data that can be used for management and exception reporting to gauge the effectiveness of the DCM plan. We talked a little bit about this morning in the searching class. Basically, you can have a workflow assigned to you, a manual workflow process assigned to you. So you log in, you see, oh, I have to review some moving papers, or I have 50 documents, 50 miscellaneous documents to file in case files, whatever your job role is, right? Once you do those things, though, they're kind of gone. They're transitory. They don't stick around forever. Well, gee, how long did it take Keith to file those miscellaneous documents? Well, it's not really that obvious. Time standards, on the other hand, are not like workflow in that respect. They are permanent. They're part of the case. You can see them in the case configuration as long as you have a time standards folder view. Since they're permanent, you can design searches like the one on the screen here. And if you were in the searching class, you know that you not only can do data dumps like this one here on the screen, but you can also design pivot table searches to give you counts. You can lay out all of your time standards on an exception, from a time standard exception report, and turn them into a pivot table and run for whatever period, last month, last quarter, last year, and see at a glance how you're doing. And remember, time standards can be not only about the big things like disposition or setting of a trial date, but they can also be about the little things like how long did it take a scheduler to schedule a case? How long did it take the mailroom to mail out something if you track that in the system? So really, the sky's the limit as far as time standards, and if it's something that is a critical function that you want to track as part of a DCM plan, then you can certainly do that. And you can do it for last year. You can compare 2 years ago to last year to this year, whatever you want, because it's permanent data. And I think that's an important point to bring up. Okay. The other awesome thing is a time standard can be a workflow trigger. Now, having said that, as it says in the big letters, anything can be a workflow trigger, so let's not get too excited about that. But a time standard can be used to trigger a workflow. So there's 3 major states that a time standard can be in, all right? It can be active, which means it's running right now. A motion document was filed yesterday. There are 30 days for the opposing counsel to get in a response. So if it was filed yesterday, that means right now it's active. All right? We don't know if the standard has been met yet. It's active. Now, if a response to that motion comes in within that 30-day time frame, that time standard gets a status of interrupted. In other words, interrupted just means a time standard that was met. All right? So an interrupted time standard could trigger a automated or a manual workflow for a clerk to schedule it for the next status conference. Okay, the response came in, schedule it for a motion hearing, for instance. Or if person did not meet the time standard, or as in eCourt speak, we call that expired. If the time standard expired, that too could trigger a workflow, but it could be a different workflow. So that if a certain time standard were met, it goes one way. If the time standard were not met, it goes another way. And usually the other way is something not that desirable from a plaintiff attorney perspective. But it could go to a dismissal hearing or an OSC calendar, something of that nature. Oh, gee, sorry, you didn't meet the discovery cutoff, so you're going to get a sanction, something of that nature. Time standards, just as anything else, can trigger a workflow. And so time standards, I think, will play a huge part in your court's implementation of a DCM plan or of just general trial delay reduction.
Can I ask a question, Keith?
Sure.
Just as a clarification. So in interpreting the term interrupted, meaning that the workflow's been set up, time standard for the DCM, and there's a certain state, let's say all parties have filed an answer, and therefore the next step would be to schedule status conference. Because that standard has been met, is the system then going to automatically set that status conference, or does that next task, if you will, or event or action that needs to happen, is it placed in somebody's work queue to do that action?
The answer is yes. And what I mean by that is those kinds of things can be done. They would be done configurably. So there's nothing in the baseline code that would do that. And the reason for that is, as is represented in this room, we've got trial courts, we've got appellate courts, we've got administrative law courts. And so there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. So that's why we don't take that task on in the baseline compiled code. So instead, one jurisdiction might want to have a clerk manually review it. They want somebody with eyes on it in order to make a decision like that. And so that's great. That's the right answer for them. Somebody else, maybe it's a higher volume court, where they decide we really haven't got time to have our best people get eyes on this. Just schedule it. And so that could be done with an automated work queue.
Okay.
And just boom, here you go.
That's just what
Find the next available time slot for Judge Jones, and boom, you got it.
Okay.
So again, as with so much about eCourt, there's usually not a one-size-fits-all answer, and that's by design.
Excuse me.
Uh-huh.
I think I'm hearing what you're saying in reference to standard, time, how it's automated and how it's set schedule, both of activity for the judges and workers.
Mhm.
I was just wondering, let's say for vacation time, judge go on vacation or workers go on vacation.
Mhm.
Is that computed in ahead of time? Let's say someone judge decides to plan a vacation 2 months or 3 months from now. Can that be done?
It can, not with time standards, because time standards are global, so therefore the whole court.
Okay.
But, for example, to Dawn's question just a moment ago, let's say your court was going to just do automated scheduling. I use the word time slots, right? Time slots are a function of eCourt that basically a given judge can decide, all right, I want to do civil law motions on Monday morning. I want to do criminal arraignments on Monday afternoons. I'll do civil trials on Tuesday mornings, and I'll do probate matters, and that'll take up Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I'll do probate matters on Friday. All right? So if somebody has some kind of a schedule like that, those can be configured as time slots, so that the configurator would go into the time slots area and set that up so that the system now knows, all right, probate matters, Friday. So if I've got a probate time standard where somebody's got to appear for a accounting order hearing for probate, right? The system can see, it's a probate case, and it's assigned to Judge Jones. And I see here Judge Jones only does probate on Friday, so the system can automatically look at the pre-configured time slots for Judge Jones and see it's going to be some Friday. So if this Friday is booked up, it will look for the next Friday, and the next Friday, and the next Friday. So that, if Judge Jones is going to take a month off and take an around-the-world cruise, then those 4 time slots for that particular month can be blocked off. So they're not available. And so, yeah, long-winded answer, but yeah, not necessarily from time standards, but from time slots. Again, I talked about the importance of the holiday table. Well, the judge and/or the judge's clerk should be keeping that judge's time slot calendar current as well, because if that judge is going to be unavailable during a time where the system expects him to be available to do a hearing on a certain kind of case, well, then that's going to be a problem. So, of course, you'd have to then vacate something and reset it, and we want to avoid that kind of stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And Keith, if a judge phoned in sick, it's simply a matter of doing it manually for that particular day, or making the adjustments or reassigning a judge. So.
Yeah. At that point, there's not much that eCourt can do. So you're going to have to either, if you have a buddy system where if Judge Bill is out and Judge Mary covers his or her calendar, that's great. If not, you have no choice. Gee, I'm sorry you came all the way downtown, but we got nobody to hear your case. That judge is sick. Then it would have to be reset, however it works. At that point, it's a manual process.
Right.
Okay. So, if you're interested in learning more about differential case management from people who really are experts in the subject, not like me, there are some resources from the National Center, of course, and some courts that have been heavily involved in, very active in developing their own differential case management plans are the Michigan State Court Administrative Office. They have a plan that is out there on the web. The city of Birmingham, the 10th Judicial District of Alabama, I should say, has a very extensive, detailed differential case management plan. And then Santa Clara County, California Superior Court also has one. And so these are resources that are available to you. I can, if anybody who wants, I can make this slide available to you after the conference, and you can have it for your information if you want.
Please.
And I should have mentioned that at the search one as well, but that stands for searching as well. So if anybody wants, I guess I can pass a sign-up sheet around. I'll be happy to send them out.
Keith, we should be able to make everything available on the conference website. So
Okay.
any of these presentations should be available for review.
All right, I just need to know who to get to then.
Yep. I'll get that to you.
Perfect. Now, that'd be even better, so we'll just have them on the website. Perfect.
I have another question. This is kind of a related court business process. It's not exactly DCM, but there is a scenario where a judge will want to take action on cases that are not moving on a track, meaning, let's say I'm gonna pick a case type of contracts, and a particular judge, that's the type of case that he manages, and he wants a report of, here's a list of all of the cases filed this calendar year where they've had the summons issued, return of service on the summons, but no answer. There's jurisdictions that call it lack of prosecution, dismiss for want of prosecution, DWAP in the civil case realm. Do we have experience today with the courts using eCourts that have some type of either workflows, use DCM, the result of a DCM track? If there were no answers filed by all of these litigants on a case, as expected, that are on a track, what next can they do with that information from the DCM track, as an example?
That's what I would use time standards for, because time standards, for new clients, I always use the term, it's a stake in the ground, right? A time standard, what's the time standard, Sarah? It's a stake in the ground. We talked about that just a month ago, right? Yes. And so the deadline for receiving an answer, for example, might be 30 days out, right? That's a stake in the ground. The time standards can track when, if all have answered, or if only some have answered, and any one of those that expires, meaning the time standard wasn't met, like I said in the presentation, it can do any number of things. So it can trigger a workflow, certainly, and that alone could have it pop up on a dismissal calendar. Or it could simply stay there, and a search is designed, a time standard exception report, that somebody can run. Maybe a judge wants to review a list of cases before just automatically setting them for a dismissal calendar, for instance. So that could be done as well. There could just be a search that is run. Actually, the judge can run it anytime he or she wants. You don't, in the olden days, the clerk had to produce the report and give the judge a piece of paper. Yeah, go get the file. Yeah, we don't have to do that anymore. Okay, Your Honor, there is the search right there. Have at it. That's where we are now. So judges can see that kind of information live enough in a minute, and then they can decide, outside of the system, okay, yeah, set that one, set that one, set that one, and not that one, if they want. Or, the easy way is just have it feed a workflow.
Yeah, I think the stake in the ground, it's the what ifs, because, especially when you're talking about civil cases, because you have multiple defendants. And so when a case is eligible for that next action, depending upon all of the defendant actions, if you will, like answers, are expected to be in place in order for then the next steps to go on. And when you may have perhaps two defendants who filed their answers, but not the third and the fourth, that kind of skews that stake in the ground for making sure you've got that solid stake in the ground, I guess.
Well, it can if you haven't figured out, okay, well, what will the court do in that scenario, right? So you're right. If there are parties who didn't file their answer on time, and yet the plaintiff didn't default, then, as you said, that might merit dismissal for lack of prosecution. You have a default that you can file, but you failed to do so. You're not really adequately prosecuting this case. So that's really more at the DCM plan level. The court has to decide, are you okay with that? Is your court going to be that hard-nosed? Some courts don't want to be the bad guys. Some courts want to be, oh, we're sorry, but you forgot to do a default, and that's cool too. Every jurisdiction's legal culture is different.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I just think that now I can see in eCourt, the tools are there on how you want to determine to manage your cases.
Exactly, well said. That's what I'm trying to show you guys here. I can't tell you all what's right for Saskatchewan or Calgary or Vermont or Oregon or Gwinnett County, but I can tell you that depending on what makes sense in your jurisdiction, there are tools here to support you. So if you decide that you want to be a more hard-nosed court, that's fine. The tools are there. If you decide you just want to have a report produced, and maybe some clerk's job is going to be to call up, the legal secretaries for those firms, oh, gee, could you get that default in, please? And that's valid too.
Okay, that was my marketing statement for the day.
There you go. All right.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right. Oh, hey, we've got a little time to go. I want to show you one thing on time standards. So let's see if we can get in. See if we have an answer here. This is a family law one, so it's not exactly what I was thinking of, but what I wanted to show you was, going back to your example, Don, you can have multiple parties, right, on a civil or, for that matter, a criminal case. You can have multiple parties. Each one of them can have their own time standard, Or you can have one time standard for all parties with a reset trigger. So we've got a start trigger. So in other words, if this thing happens on a case, then the time standard that is defined here on this screen, so this is a time standard definition screen, it's not a time standard, all right? But this screen determines, no, I don't want to update iTunes, thank you very much. This screen determines what time standard will be created on a case when such and such a thing happens.
Based on the state.
Hmm?
Based on this state.
Based on this state. So the start trigger is if a case is inserted, well, any case apparently. Do we have a condition in there? No, we don't. Oh, this grouping over here would restrict it to a family law case. So time standard group basically equals case type. So when a case is filed, a proof of service of summons is due 40 days after case filing date. Not the time it was triggered, because it could be Monday, I could be entering cases into the system today, but really the piece of paper came in over the counter on Friday at 4:45 and nobody had time to deal with it. So the filing date really would be last Friday, not today. And you can do that. You can go either find some date value on some field and use that as the trigger, or use the current date. That's what that's telling you. And furthermore, this is the thing that will interrupt that time standard. In other words, so what this is looking for is a document tracking record is inserted on a document that's called summons. And the document tracking means is served. So somebody enters the document, it's called the summons, and they then add a document tracking record called served. When those things happen, this time standard is interrupted, meaning the time standard was met. If those things don't happen within 40 days, this time standard will be expired, was not met. But
What's a document tracking?
a document tracking is a kind of record in eCourt. So you've got a document record, right? That's pretty obvious. And underneath that is another table called document tracking that you can use for statuses like it was served, or who served it, or where the document is physically located, whatever you want. So it's just a kind of record. In this configuration, it was used to track service status.
Is this, in a translation, is this a code representing the document that the court received from the service provider, that in fact this summons was served on this party?
Exactly.
Okay, so within the application though, it is the type of code representing that document returned to the court.
So somebody, some clerk, has to, or it could be electronically filed over the portal.
Right, okay.
But somebody has to know enough of what they're doing to know this piece of paper here, that's really a
Yes,
summons.
yeah, okay, it's a code
Because
representing
if
that
they
type of
don't do
document.
that, then this time standard will expire erroneously, because maybe they really did it, but Jane, the new clerk, didn't realize this was a summons, and so she coded it as a,
Okay.
who's he was this?
It's just a naming thing,
Mhm.
but yeah, okay.
So those are defined conditions, or
Yes.
when you go.
So what does that look like? So when a document tracking is inserted, but only if it meets this condition, which is summons was served. You know, it's a summons and it has a document tracking value of served. That's what that says. And when that happens, complete the trigger. Now this one, what I wanted to show you, doesn't have a reset trigger, but this kind of goes to your point earlier, Don. If there are multiple occurrences of some time standard, you can build in a reset trigger. What's that? If the initial creation of this time standard was case insert, but if something else happens, I want you to reset that time standard. Give it a new 40-day period. So that could potentially be one use of, one way of getting around what you were thinking of. All right, great. There are 3 parties on this case, okay? The first one was served on March 9th. Initiate that time standard. He's got until April 9th, right? His answer comes in. The second party was served on May 5th. Reset that time standard, because now I've got a whole new 40-day period that I want to track.
Oh, okay, I got you.
And that person's answer comes in on June 1st. The third guy wasn't served until July. When that proof of service comes in, reset this time standard. Give it a new 40 days for that guy to answer.
Yeah, it's like a pseudo party triggers that are
Uh-huh.
happening, because I don't see in these rules how they can be specified as case party specific, maybe by case party type or something.
They can because of this thing up here, which it depends on the placement of the time standard.
Okay, that's why, then you'd probably want those on probably like a party then,
Bingo.
and make by a party type.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So you can tie it not just to a case, to a document, to a party,
Yeah,
to
okay.
a scheduled event.
Okay.
And when you do that, you're not just saying, this is related in some vague way to documents or parties or scheduled events. You are actually going to tie it to a specific record, a specific party.
Okay.
So, and it will know that because of this placement object, so that if a party gets a status of served, and that triggers a time standard, the time standard that was created by virtue of that trigger will be linked to that one party. And you can follow that in the
That
database.
totally makes sense now, because the entity is not so case, but it is very case party specific. Yep, okay,
Yeah.
I got you.
So, and again, like I've been saying all day long, there's no one right answer, but rather it depends on the situation. Here you see a list of all the entities that you could potentially place a time standard on. Basically, it's all of them.
Already.
Some case type.
Case type is a field on case, so that's not an entity. But case category is actually its own entity, and of course I want to be able to find it when I want to use the category.
Case type doesn't
Was that done?
I think you saw, didn't you have the upper screen?
Standards that are running, I can pause them just as I can case agent.
Do those have to be automated, or is there a manual way to trigger the pause?
There is, yes. Like any other kind of record, a time standard record is going to have an update form. You can go into it and change the status at any time. It doesn't change.
Okay, so there is a status
Yeah, so these are
Pause.
different, yeah, it's suspended.
suspended?
Yeah. And then there's also a canceled status. Yeah, they're not very commonly used. The biggies are interrupted, active, and expired. And then, of course, if you have a pause, you can have a resume. Now, I should point out, I'm not going to change this, but let's say the completion trigger of this were not an insert record of some kind, but rather an update of some kind. If I say update, I can narrow it down to a specific field. Gray document tracking was updated, but I only want you to complete this time standard if the status is the field that was updated, and the system knows what was updated. So it knows if you go in there and change the status on a document tracking record, that will complete this trigger, this time standard. Questions? All right.
I know I asked this when you came to Vermont, but do you have some kind of guiding rule between what you would use a workflow for as opposed to a time standard?
Yes, they're not really mutually exclusive at all. A time standard, as I said, is just a tool to track dates, to track deadlines with. Right? It's not really going to do anything. It's just going to measure the distance between when something was supposed to happen and when it really did happen. A workflow, on the other hand, is a specific task to perform. So I said in one of these slides that the expiration of a time standard could trigger some workflow. A workflow means, hey, Judy, you got to do this. This is what you have to do. Now, the system doesn't tell Judy, if it maybe said, set for dismissal. The system's not going to tell you how to do that. You already know how to do that. But the system is simply telling you, rather than you waiting for someone to come and bring paper to you and say, okay, see this, I want you to set this for a dismissal calendar, you'll just get a workflow task that will take the place of that. So it's the waiting for paper to move around your building that goes away with workflow. Not people using their experience to do those processes. You still got to do those processes, but you don't need to wait for Betty Sue to come and give you a stack of 50 of them before you start on the first one. The system will automatically notify you, oh look, here's a case that needs to be set for a dismissal calendar. And you'll get it, and you do it, and boom, and it's done. So workflow, if it's a manual task, if it's a manual workflow, it's a notification to somebody to do some specific task. There's an actual thing you've got to do. And when you do that, if it's something inside the system, the workflow can be configured to automatically complete, just like this time standard. But whereas, that's for a manual, a workflow could also be automated, meaning no human does anything, but something happens. The system does something, right? Depending on what it is you want it to do, right? But, so workflows basically make something specific happen. It's a very specific task. And it's something that, I don't know, John, I don't know what you do, but I know that I need to tell you, hey, here's some motions for you to review. And then you take it from there, right? So, but the time standard is simply a tracking mechanism. It's not going to get anything done other than, oh look, this didn't happen on time. That's it. That's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. You helped me understand some more. Again, I say the tools. I mean, it's just all of those elements are there and the foundation in order to set up. As long as you know what your business rules are, what you're trying to achieve, i.e. use the term stake in the ground. As long as you know what you're trying to achieve or find out from the system, then you can set that up.
The tools are there. All right. Well, thank you. Good to see you, right?
See you.